Forbes Books presents Sustainable Leadership and Disruptive Growth with David Radlo. Transformation for a new and better world. Here's David.
Do you feel that we are safer in our country and the world than we were a few years ago? What are some of the most recent intelligent failures and economic situations that have led to threatening our nation? Is it possible to analyze the geopolitical threats worldwide of China, Iran, North Korea, along with Russia, that would benefit us in transforming for a safer, new, and better world? Can we learn from what President Clinton did in Bosnia in order to solve the Ukraine situation? To answer these important questions is my special guest this week, retired Brigadier General and President and CEO of Tata Leadership Group, Anthony Tata. Tony is a decorated military leader, author, advisor, and public servant. His distinguished 34-year military career included commanding airborne, air assault, mountain divisions, as well as deployments to Afghanistan, Bosnia, Croatia, Panama, Kosovo, and Haiti. He also served as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, overseeing the implementation of key strategic initiatives for the Department of Defense. He is also a geopolitical and military strategic threat assessment expert that has been featured on Fox News, Fox Business, and NBC. More than that, General Tony is considered to be better than Tom Clancy as a best-selling author of over a dozen thrillers. To round him out, he has also served on several corporate and nonprofit boards as a former Secretary of Transportation in North Carolina and in leadership of both Washington, D.C. and Wake County school systems. General, we appreciate your service to our country very much, and welcome to the podcast.
Great to be with you, Dave. Thank you.
General Tony, when we first met, it was shortly after the U.S. pulled out of Afghanistan. Congressman Seth Moulton, a Democrat from Massachusetts and a former Marine who served in Iraq, labeled it publicly a total effing disaster. Some have characterized this chapter of how America cut and ran with no apparent plan with regard to leaving armaments to be used and sold to whomever by the Taliban, perhaps other non-friendly adversaries. Troubling as we left quickly without taking care of the people that took care of us and the cost U.S. servicemen's lives in the process. Would you be so kind to share with your own knowledge how this plan and how or why it was not accepted?
Yeah, absolutely, Dave. First of all, in the Trump administration, we had a plan that was to consolidate on Bagram, which is the most fortified base in Afghanistan, has old Russian minefields around it, fencing, guard posts every quarter mile or so, a very fortified base, as opposed to what the Biden administration did, which was go to the least fortified base in Kabul and really take what is primarily a DoD function and hand it over to the Department of State. The Biden administration overturned every single thing that I can think of that we had been doing in DoD, to include purging the entire, every board, Defense Policy Board, the Technology Board, the Acquisition Board, which, you had people like Kissinger and Albright and all of them on there, on the defense, and I was on the Defense Policy Board. They eliminated all that, so they didn't want any diversity of thought, diversity of opinion, continuity. They thought that they had all the answers. And of course, it's obvious they didn't. And quite frankly, it was stunning to me on many levels because having served in combat in Afghanistan, one of the things that, there's an entire generation of soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, DoD civilians that have rotated through Afghanistan, that know people that have lost their lives or lost limbs or had traumatic brain injury or other types of wounds in Afghanistan. So this disaffection, this lack of this laissez-faire attitude toward, we're going to get out of here, just fly out of Kabul. And the incompetence of particularly the Central Command commander, Frank McKenzie, and his laissez-faire attitude really goes to show that we have a real rot within not only the political appointees, but within the services, the lack of compassion for the entire generation of men and women that rotated through Afghanistan, not to mention the paratroopers and Marines and Special Forces soldiers that were in at Abbey Gate, the 13 that were killed, the 24 that lost limbs or had other serious traumatic injuries. That was completely unnecessary. And then the gratis shooting of the water boy driving around as an NGO, non-governmental organization employee, delivering water to people, and they kill him and lie to the American public and say they got the planner of the Abbey Gate attack. So the disaffection, the incompetence, all of that signaled to the world, this is a clown show and America is weak. And if we're going to do something, let's do it. And so you have Russia begin to move troops to the Ukrainian border. What they had done in Crimea in 2014, Maidan riots, under Obama, they did nothing of the sort under Trump. And then less than a year after Biden takes over, they're back at it. Putin encircles, at least in the north and the east and parts of the south, Ukraine. And at that same time, Iran began planning with Hamas and Hezbollah for what has happened, roughly 2 years later. It takes time to arm up and plan. But this administration's infatuation with Iran is inexplicable. The progressive left and Hamas are not that far apart ideologically. The Islamic extremism that feeds into the United States progressive left is they're not that far misaligned. So I believe that this administration has to pay homage to that, and therefore to Iran. Iran is funding all this terrorism. We're giving money to Iran openly. We don't even make it a secret anymore. And that money displaces money that can then be used to fund terrorism. It is not complicated. But for this administration, it's very craven and political. First of all, Biden obviously is corrupt and all about enriching himself and aggrandizing his family, and probably trying to stay out of jail now. And then you have the overarching administration, and they're being beholden to local politics to try to stay in power. So you've got Tlaib blackmailing Biden and saying, if you don't stop supporting Israel, I'm going to make sure my district doesn't vote for you. And you have the squad, AOC, and the other folks doing the same thing. So Biden is trying to placate the radical Islamic left within the United States, while really, honestly, just paying lip service to the Jewish community. He's really done nothing demonstrable to support Israel other than information. The real funding and the money is flowing to Iran to support Hamas. And so it's a really interesting dynamic going on right now. And Israel has to say nice things about the president because, they want American support. But I have friends over there, and I know they're not happy with the way things are going. So,
okay, I understand, and certainly it's very hard to plan and execute as a military person when you got the feeling that you don't have support, or for that your hands may be behind your back. I wanted to focus some due attention overall as you look at Russia, China, Iran-backed proxies in the Mideast and North Korea. Appreciate your assessment on these parties in terms of their military and economic stability, threat to the U.S. and our allies based upon strength and willingness to wage war, and noting the weaknesses. specifically as we were just talking about Iran and their proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis in Yemen and Syria. I was in Metula, Israel, at the border to Lebanon a few years ago on a guided security tour with the IDF. And the intelligence pointed out where the Iranian leadership in front of Hezbollah gave a speech a week earlier that said, "Death to Israel, death to America," and drive the U.S. out of the region. Pretty straightforward. Recently, the Internal Atomic Energy Commission stated that Iran has increased its use of nuclear enrichment, while at the same time they don't allow for full verification of all their facilities for peaceful purposes. Further, Iran has nefarious as may see, as you touched on, they're developing hypersonic improvements in their missiles, and they're engaging in a long-term asymmetrical warfare using their own people casualties due to retaliation from the October 7 barbaric Hamas terrorist attack against Israeli citizens, perhaps with a long-term strategy of influence in the media, academics, and Western citizens and civilization in moderate Arab nations that Israel is the culprit, and to force a slow down peace with the Abraham Accords and bring about their overall goals. Notwithstanding pauses in fighting that we're seeing as of Thanksgiving right now, their continued military confrontation needed with strength to handle the threat, and what is appropriate in terms of a retaliation that our listeners, you could explain for attacks against our troops stationed in the Middle East. And what does the president stand behind his word don't? What does that actually mean? The DOD, according to the Washington Post, says they're quite frustrated with an incoherent strategy to deter and suffering injuries, quite serious, of our American servicemen with traumatic brain injuries and worse, while turning over, as you just mentioned, further monies to Iran, perhaps showing weakness. What's your assessment, General Tata, and what would your recommendation be if you were in your former seat?
Wow, Dave, a lot to unpack there. First, as part of your preamble, what I would say is the books behind me address everything you just talked about. So like Chasing the Lion here talks about Iran's drive to hegemony in the Middle East. Total Empire here talks about China's development of hypersonic weapons. Phalanx Code, which comes out in February from St. Martin's Press, talks about techno-fascism. And so if you put all three of those together, as you were elaborating on, the position that we find ourselves in this world today because of a lack of American strength is that our enemies like Iran, like China, like Russia have all risen and are flexing their muscles, and the United States is not effective diplomatically. Blinken is probably the most incompetent Secretary of State that this country has seen in my lifetime, for sure. And military, working through the elements of national power, the application of military power, I think with the recruiting woes that we have, the inability to meet recruiting targets, the inability to field full standing units is known by our enemies. So they read our newspapers too, and they understand our readiness levels, which are not awesome. So when Biden says don't to Iran, it's probably the stupidest messaging I've ever heard. Don't what? Don't stop? Don't attack? Don't what? So the president's messaging is meaningless. I think Iran laughs at him because he don't, but here's $10 billion. Don't, but continue to sell oil to China. It's utterly meaningless, and he's not challenged on it by the press. Imagine if Trump said that. Don't. It'd be a meme, and they'd be making fun of him. He's destabilizing the world. Everything that the media was fabricating and saying about Trump is actually really happening under Biden, and they're working overtime to cover it up and re-message it.
That's an interesting take on the political ramifications. Hey, going back to China, they seem to be invested for the long term, as Mao said, to bury us. But their MSCI lost $2 trillion in 2 years, or 54%. Do you see a strategic opportunity for China taking Taiwan now, including prize shipping lanes, semiconductor supply chain, and other businesses? Or can the U.S. negotiate and woo them away from their strong relationship from Russia, Iran, and North Korea?
Well, no. There's very little negotiation that I think Xi would ever. He knows that he's got the upper hand. He knows that it's Keystone Cops in D.C. So I think I don't believe. I'll say this, and they'll attack tomorrow. But I don't believe China wants to bomb Taiwan in the Stone Ages. I believe that they want to use their strategic leverage to help them economically. And if that means subsuming Taiwan like they did Hong Kong, sort of a soft takeover instead of a hostile takeover, that's my assessment. Of course, they're flying fighter jets and bombers up to the midline of the Taiwan Strait every day. Ultimately, they haven't done it yet. And there was a window when Russia attacked Ukraine. That might have been a window. There's a window now with us focused now, instead of myopically on Ukraine, we're focused on Eastern Europe and the Middle East, and our forces are stretched thin, as I previously mentioned. Diplomacy is not going to do anything that alter that equation. And decoupling them from North Korea, Iran, and Russia is not in their strategic interest right now. Their strategic interest is in continuing to pressure the United States through the war in Ukraine, through the war now in Israel, and to keep the United States focused away from the Pacific Rim. And so it's smooth sailing for them at the moment. Economically, they got some troubles, but geopolitically, I don't see anything disrupting that balance of power right now.
Thanks for that. When you take a look and move back to Russia and Ukraine and focusing on the end game, Russia initially went over the whole block of cheese, so to speak, when they went to Kyiv and failed. And then they turned around and went after another piece of cheese after Crimea and East, a mineral and agrarian rich sector, and reaping human destruction and looting valuables wherever they could. Former CIA agent Mike Baker in the President's Daily Brief has stated that there's up to over 500,000 casualties on both sides. What is generally the end game here?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Dave, because you're not allowed to talk about any kind of negotiated settlement, as Obama did when he was president. Now, if you say, well, we should have a conversation, you're a Putin stooge, you're all in with Russia, you hate Ukraine or whatever, and the media mob comes after you hard. And it's a shame because people are dying, families are hurting. This lack of diplomacy, this lack of ability to say, we should have a conversation. When this happened in Bosnia, I was on the ground there. Wes Clark and Bill Clinton hammered out a negotiated settlement and said, look, everybody claims, this land is their land. We're going to draw a line. We're going to put in a peace enforcement force that's NATO, and they'll have a zone of separation, and we'll keep everybody apart. And that has been pretty effective for, 20 some years now, right? 1990, almost 30 years. And then, we did the same thing in Kosovo. And now it's anathema to even mention a peace agreement when Obama did it. Obama didn't have anything to do with it. It was he looked the other way as they reached the agreement through the Normandy format. It was Germany, Ukraine, Russia, and France that hammered out this agreement. So, all right, you got Crimea and a little bit of land, northeast of Crimea, and we'll call it a day. And it was relatively peaceful then, but nobody called Obama a Putin stooge. Nobody said, you're a Russian spy. That's all the narrative now, and that's how destructive all these lies about Trump, Russia, and all of that are to our foreign policy, because now we can't talk about it. And again, no one really cares about the Ukrainian and Russian soldiers who are dying. In fact, Lindsey Graham cheers them that they're dying, but the Russians are dying. But at the end of the day, these are, cannon fodder going at it because politicians are, can't have a conversation. In the grand scheme of things, I guess it's to the media, it's meaningless, and it's more important to have the narrative and have the political talking point that, if you want to talk about peace, you're a Putin stooge. We got to get away from that, and we got to find a negotiated settlement.
Okay, following up, if you'd be kind enough on Russia, to care a comment on Russia pulling out of the nuclear arms agreements with the U.S.?
Yeah, well, there's a few agreements, at least when I was undersecretary, that we were having conversations with about the intermediate range nuclear forces, that Russia just continued to do that, even though there was a ban on them. And we were not building them. And so we said, well, what's the point in being in this thing if Russia's just going to violate it? So there was that agreement. And then certainly the Open Skies Treaty, again, Russia was getting overflight rights of all of our training and all of our nuclear sites, and yet we weren't getting reciprocity. And so those are the two big agreements that provided significant transparency, but Putin just quit doing it. And so what do you do when you're in a treaty and the other side is not living up to its end of the bargain? There's a lot of different game theory and all that you can get into. But at the end of the day, you have to make a realist calculation about what's best for your country. What is the right thing for the United States? Is it to allow Russia to continue to build intermediate range nuclear weapons and us not do that, even though they're not supposed to? Or is it to abandon the treaty and then get back at work building intermediate range nuclear weapons? And I can remember there was a lot of conversations, scrambling. And this was something that was dumped right at the transition. There was very little interest in any of the hard work that had gone into national security when the new administration came in. There was zero interest in understanding everything that we had done. So that's my take on that.
Okay, just thank you. Attorney to North Korea, poor country that's a wild card, extension of China, or a major threat to the U.S. and its allies?
Yeah, so North Korea, I think President Trump did a good job in sort of neutering them, I would say, slowing their production of significant weaponry. And certainly they quit testing nuclear weapons. Their relevance is overshadowed, in my view, by Iran, China, Russia, and that alliance that has been ossifying given this administration's miscalculations with regard to the geopolitical environment. North Korea is a threat. I'm not convinced that, our troops in the infantry and our Air Force and all of our 30,000 troops in the Korean Peninsula are there to help South Korea defend itself or to keep South Korea from going into North Korea. I think they're very capable. The Republic of Korea Army is a very capable force, and North Korea has significant artillery and missile capability, and so that demilitarized zone and the truce that is there is significant, and that it's held now for since 1952. So they're a geopolitical factor that we have to continue to. They fix our forces in that region. And our forces in South Korea can also reposition to the Pacific Rim should they need to be able to do that.
Okay, thank you for that on North Korea as we turn down and drill down on weaknesses and opportunities of our nation. This is really a point of information on this question. The Institute of Study Wars noted recently on the program Firing Line with Margaret Huber that we are not in a strong position short, medium, and long term for the wars of the future, both in assets to counter our enemies and peoples, as we mentioned earlier, cited with depleted reserve in two conflicts, not invested in long-term adversary. Meanwhile, accounting reports at DOD, which many news organizations have put out, put approximately 50% or $2 trillion in assets are unaccounted for by the DOD. What's your assessment? Would you be kind enough to teach us how does the military plan?
Well, yeah. So one is how does it plan, and then you're talking about the missing funds as well. But
And assets.
yeah, in assets. From a planning perspective, before I left, when I was performing the duties of Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, one of the last things I did was sign the defense planning guidance. The defense planning guidance matches the strategy, the national defense strategy, with the budget. So you're aligning your resources to fund those areas that are consistent with what the president and the administration believes are the national priorities for national security. And so that then goes into the mix master with Congress and the Senate and the House all doing their version of the National Defense Authorization Act. And generally, usually they get pretty close. There's always some give and take so that, because, that's our democracy, right? You have different viewpoints, and ultimately it's an exchange between the executive branch and the legislative branch. And then there's an end result, and then it's funded, and then that funding flows down to the services, and the services each have procurement and funding mechanisms. There's long lead items like the F-35 and the Abrams tanks and the future Army aircraft. And then there's, stuff that you got to buy right away, like M4s and ammo and artillery shells and fuel for operations. And there's a contingency operations fund of funds overseas operations. There's a misalignment generally because we say China is the number one issue, but the Pacific Rim receives less of the funding than the Middle East, Central Command, and European Command now. And so current operations are tending to skew the overall budgeting process so that the Pacific Command, responsible for deterring China, has less funding than it might ought to if you did a straight line interpretation of the national defense strategy. So, and the assets get bought and, all the way down to signed down to the user level. And you have debacles like in Afghanistan where all those assets just ended up in enemy hands. And when you have a lot of contingency operations going on, I think that the loss rate obviously goes up percentage-wise based on your assets. But as far as, I was in the planning as the policy guy. I was more in the planning aspect of the budgeting, not in the execution of the budgeting that happens down at the service level. But certainly, good people trying to do the right thing. But contingency operations, I think, drive up the loss factor.
Okay, that's understandable. All right, General Tony, stand by for a moment. We have to stop here. But coming up next time on Sustainable Leadership and Disruptive Growth with retired Brigadier General Anthony Tata, Tony continues with his expert geopolitical and military threat assessment, along with sharing his secret sauce behind his best-selling thriller series and the number one leadership lesson he learned during his military career.
Love the people you lead and listen to them. You've got to really have a servant's heart. you have to care more about them than you do yourself. And then, then you've got to be able to pull out of that and make an informed decision. But loving the people you lead and listening to them.
To connect with David, go to davidradlo.com. David's book set, The Principles of Cartel Disruption and Secret Stories of Leadership, Growth, and Innovation, are available wherever books are sold. This has been Sustainable Leadership and Disruptive Growth with David Radlo, a presentation of Forbes Books.